the influence of the VLA Max on your threshold and on your fat max increases with the VO2 max. So it is not linear, it's not straightforward. You can just not say, the influence of VLA Max on my threshold of fat max is XYZ.
That Triathlon Show 237. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Sebastian Weber, who is a coach, exercise physiologist, and the founder of the software company INSCYD. Sebastian and INSCYD work with World Tour cycling teams, multiple national federations across endurance sports, from triathlon to speed skating, and individual athletes at the very highest level in various endurance sports. In this interview, we discuss physiology and the new and updated version of the INSCYD software for performance testing called the Power Performance Decoder, or PPD. We go into how it's possible to calculate VO2 max and VLA max, or maximum glycolytic capacity, using power data only. You don't need to go to a lab to do that. The algorithm can calculate them for you. And we discuss how accurate the test results are, the utility of knowing these physiological parameters and some benchmarks for them, as well as how these test results that you may get on the bike if you do the test protocol in the remote setting, so with the power only version, how that relates to running and swimming physiology, and much, much more. This is actually a two-part interview, so today you will hear part one of the interview, and in episode 238 next week you'll hear part two. Big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. If you are planning on doing any long endurance events during these hot summer months, then getting a gauge on what your individual sweat sodium concentration is can be a key part of really figuring out how to get through those long events in a hot climate. Precision Hydration has developed an online sweat test, which is a simple quiz that you can go and take for free on their website in just a few minutes' time. And that will give you a good ballpark estimate for how much sodium you lose in your sweat. And that will help you calculate how much sodium you should replace in your event. So go and check that out. And if you want to try any other electrolytes, use the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15 to get 15% off your order on precisionhydration.com. And thank you to Roka. Roka have recently launched 3 new products that I've talked about in various episodes before. We have 2 wetsuits, the Maverick MX, the max buoyancy wetsuit, and the Maverick X2, which is the updated version of Roka's flagship wetsuit model. Then we also have the Matador sunglasses. Roka very kindly sent all of those to me, and I actually just got them days ago as I record this, and I have definitely tried the Matador sunglasses on a lot of my runs and rides, or on all of them since I got them actually, and I absolutely love them. I have also tried the Maverick MX, the max buoyancy wetsuit in the open water, and that was really great. You can really notice the buoyancy in that. I have not yet tried the Maverick X2. I was choosing between trying the MX and trying the X2, and I decided to save the best for last, so I'll try the X2 the next time I go to the open water. But I can only assume that it's going to be absolutely fantastic, seeing as I already own the Maverick X wetsuit, the predecessor, and I assume that the X2 is going to be an upgrade on that. So really, really exciting new product launches from Roka in recent months. You can go and check them out on roka.com/TTS, which is where you'll get a 20% discount on your order. One more thing about this episode before we get into the interview. It was recorded in 2 different parts, so there is a bit of cutting and pasting going on in there. Basically, we wanted to re-record a part of the original recording where we just got a bit too technical and missed out on giving the all-important overview of what we're talking about. And that means that there might be some points later in the interview where some small details may be repeated and so on. For the most part, there shouldn't be any big overlaps, and nothing is missing from it either. So it's all there. It's just explained and laid out a bit better. But if you're wondering why there may be some repeated aspects or things that are slightly disconnected, then that is the reason why. And but you will probably hear that these two recordings are from that this interview is from two different recordings, because I had some audio issues actually that I didn't notice in the first part of the recording, or in the second part of the recording, as you'll hear this, the first take of our recording. And I must have forgotten to set my microphone settings correctly in the excitement for this interview. So sorry about that, but I hope it will be good, decent audio anyway. Now, without any further ado, sorry to keep you waiting, let's hear this interview with Sebastian Weber. All right, so just as a reference for the listeners here, we are recording this part, these questions here, until you will hear another sort of audio bumper at a separate time and day to what we did with the original recording, because we felt that there were some parts missing and that we didn't really get to in a great way in the first recording. So let's just start with this question, Sebastian. What is the power performance decoder, and why is it an important tool?
So, the power performance decoder, and I guess this is, I can start with how we came up with the name actually. The power performance decoder is a technology which is bridging the gap between your power duration curve, mean max power outputs, your mechanical power that you measure with your power meter when you're out there training, racing, testing, and the physiological background, so the physiology of your body, of your muscle metabolism. So what I mean with that is, most people will be familiar with like power duration curves, FTP, critical power kind of stuff. That's how they use their power meters. And then you might have heard something like of lactate threshold and VO2 max and these kind of things. And they're, kind of stand a little bit separately, right? Like you can go to a lab and get your lactate profile and your lactate threshold 1 and 2 or whatsoever, or VO2 max, and then you go out on your bike and you have your power duration curve and your critical power. But there is no direct connection within the world of coaching or with you or as for you as an athlete. But obviously, physiologically speaking, there is a very, very direct connection, right? Because the power that you see on your computer, 300 watts, 400 watts for 3 minutes, 4 minutes, whatsoever, is obviously produced metabolically, energetically speaking, by the physiology of your muscles, so by your muscles. So there is a link. And this is basically the link. This is where the name comes from, power to performance decoder, so to speak. This is what the PPD, as we call it, the power performance decoder, bridges. So it is able to morph and to link power duration data, mechanical power outputs from your bike computer to physiological aspects of your performance. And saying this, it basically runs partly or only on power data, which you obtain riding outdoors, indoors, basically obtained by yourself, and or in combination with lactate measurements, either you have from the lab or from a field testing, and or something like VO2 measurements. If you do a VO2 max REM test in a physiological human performance lab, it takes it all. So it basically takes all those data sources and composes one complete picture, one complete overview of your performance.
And why is it important? Why are we interested in getting the physiological data in the first place? If we have the power data, we know how much power we can produce for a minute, 10 minutes, an hour. Why do we care about physiology?
Right. No, that's an excellent question. And maybe you don't. And that's fair enough, right? Like you can say, well, the best indicator, some people say, for performance is performance itself, right? So, or taking it one step further, you can say, when I push more power, I'm more powerful, very obviously, right? So that's fair enough. That's true. But the reason why you maybe want to go at least one level deeper here is when you want to improve at a certain point, whether, sooner or later, you will end up at a situation where you will find it very, very helpful to understand how this power is actually produced. Because only when you understand the mechanism, or when you understand how your performance is composed, you will be able to adjust or work on your performance by training, saying only then you will be able to identify which area needs work in order to improve your overall performance. And triathlon is the best example for that, right? Let's imagine an athlete comes to you and is asking for help. He asks you to get coached. And he says, well, I want to improve my Ironman time. Let's say my current Ironman time is 12 hours. And one of the first things, that is why triathlon is just such a great example here. One of the first things the coach is going to ask is, okay, how much time do you spend in the water of these 12 hours Ironman time? How much time you spend in the water? How much time you spend on the bike? And how much time you spend in your running shoes? And when you ask this question, basically what you're doing, you're dissecting the performance, the overall 12-hour performance. You want to understand on the first level how this 12 hours is composed. And you're asking this question because you want to understand where should you focus on in training, right? Because, for example, if it's a 12-hour Ironman total time, and the guy says, well, I'm spending 5 hours on my bike, then this already indicates that there might be some work needed on the running and or swimming part. And this is the same for your power output. When you just look at the power output, yeah, fair enough. It tells you if you're more powerful. But if you want to understand how to improve that power, you need to understand in which areas, like how is the power composed, and then where should I work on in order to improve this? Otherwise, it's just like, flying blind.
Yeah, no, that's a great analogy. And can you explain how it actually works?
Right. So on a high level, what the power performance decoder needs or wants is to, we talk about it, it has 3 pillars. So the power performance decoder has 3 pillars, which is one is your anaerobic threshold, or you can also say FTP or whatsoever, right? So that's one metric it needs to have in order to create your full physiological profile. Or it needs to calculate or get from the data that you enter, I'm saying, right? Then another pillar, the second pillar, is your VO2 max, your maximum aerobic capacity, or performance to be more precise. And the third one is your VLA Max, your maximum glycolytic, power production. So it always needs those 3 parts here. And then how you get there, how you get those values is actually, that's where the flexibility kicks in. So you could get your VO2 max from just enter it what you measured in the lab in a REM test. You can get it by one hard effort riding outdoors with lactate measurements, or, and that's one of the newer parts here, you could get it just riding, for example, a 3-minute all-out effort by yourself, only measuring the power output without measuring the lactate. And then the same goes along for the VLA Max. So your VLA Max, you maybe did, a lab test where somebody used the SRM high performance ergometer with the validated protocol, and you have a valid VLA Max. So you can just enter it, for example. Or you do some kind of sprint test outside measuring lactate, or, and that's, again, the new thing here, I guess, you can just do something like approximately 20-second seated sprint by yourself, only with the power outside. And then with the FTP or threshold, you could either do another 2 efforts minimum, longer efforts like 5 minutes, 10, 12 minutes, so that the power performance decoder creates your, power duration curve. Nothing new here, I guess, right? That's what other software packages do as well. And then get your anaerobic threshold, the FTP value from a power duration curve, or, which I think is a nice way to do it as well, you can just manually enter your FTP values that you get from whatever, Golden Cheetah, WKO, or something. So you can basically use third-party data information, like your model FTP or something as well, and then therefore reduce the testing time tremendously.
Okay, and so how does it work with the protocol? Even though it's flexible, but there is a sort of a certain protocol that you can follow as one example. Can you explain that, and how, based on those all-out efforts, you can actually calculate those physiological metrics?
Yeah. So especially in these, last weeks with the COVID-19 situation and the lockdowns, what became very popular was the way to use the power performance decoder only based on power data, because it obviously allows you to do a fully remote testing, right? You don't have to be face to face with your athlete, right? So in this case, it would only run on maximum power efforts, and the standard protocol, like, again, there's flexibility to it, but the standard protocol that we kind of recommend, and there are even like, Swift protocols created in collaboration with Swift, where which guides you through it. The basic protocol, default protocol, contains a 20-second all-out effort. It contains a 3-minute all-out effort, and then a 6-minute and a 10 to 12-minute. And you are very flexible with the last ones. You can do whatever, 5 and 13 or 7 and 15 or whatever, right? And so how this works, the first easiest one, the 3-minute and 6 and 12, just to stick with that example, as I indicated, it's just doing an ordinary power duration curve. So there's nothing too fancy here. I guess we need to explain. It's nothing new, so to speak, when it comes to this part.
To get the FTP.
And then, to get a good idea of your FTP, right? It's not precisely the same as your anaerobic threshold or maximum lactate steady state, but it's kind of good enough for what we need, and it does the trick, because there's a cross-validation in there. We can talk about this as well, but for now, so that's just a power duration curve, and it's good enough. It's good enough to get your threshold value, so to speak. And then the 3-minute test there is mainly there to determine your VO2 max value. And again, just going back to that, you could also do it with lactate, and it adds a little bit of precision, right? But you can also do it without lactate. And basically what it is, if you think about it, a 3-minute effort is basically long enough to elicit your VO2 max, right? Even if you have slow oxygen kinetics, it will be long enough to reach your VO2 max, right?
Yep.
But then a good portion of the power, let's say, just put a number here, you write 3 minutes at 400 watts. So it will elicit VO2 max, but it doesn't mean, and you can feel that when you do it, obviously, everybody knows that not the entire 400 watts is made up aerobically, right? Not the entire 400 watts comes from the VO2. There's a good portion, you can feel that it's anaerobically, right? That is, for example, by lactate accumulation. And the key part here, and this is, what it makes it really, really accurate, and this is why, for example, professional cycling teams are using it as a full substitute for lab testing, is, so sticking with that example, the 400 watts example, because we know the VLA Max and we know the overall physiology from your athlete, from all these tests and all this data, it is possible to very, very accurately calculate how much of this 400 watts is not produced aerobically. So it's not coming from your VO2 max. And this is basically the key here. So it's not a fixed percentage where you go, whatever, a 3-minute effort is 120% of your VO2 max, or 115 or something, right? Because the question of how much energy in this 3-minute effort comes from non-aerobic sources is a question on how good is your glycolytic system, for example, developed, right?
Yep.
So this is hopefully explaining, what the 3-minute effort is for. And this also gets you an idea how you can use additional lactate readings, because the lactate readings, the amount of lactate is produced, will indicate how much energy comes from the glycolytic system, right? So instead of calculating it, when you have lactate values, we basically measure, so to speak, how much energy comes from the glycolytic system. And if you don't want to take the lactate, you do it without, and we calculate it. And we calculate it based on the VLA max. And this brings us to your 20 seconds test, right? So the 20 seconds test is obviously mainly there to determine your VLA max, glycolytic power production, right?
Yeah.
And in the past, in the last weeks, this created some question marks with some people, and mostly with people who came from, I do a VLA max on a 15-second sprint test or something, right? That's what I'm accustomed to, and I'm taking lactate samples before and after, right? This is where some people are coming from in terms of lab testing. And to be honest, this protocol of a 15-second sprint test taking lactate before and after derived from, my research work in 2002, 2003, where we used, also the muscle biopsies to compare, VLA max or glycolytic power in the sprint to, to the activity, so turnover rates of glycolytic enzymes in the muscle. So this 15-second sprint test was basically validated using muscle biopsies. But it's only valid when you know how to set up your ergometer. So sorry, I'm going a little bit into the weeds here, but basically when you want to do a sprint test with lactate measurements before and afterwards to determine VLA max, the question is, how do you set up the sprint test in order to allow the athlete to reach maximum power, right? If you overgear or undergear, if you overgear, the gear is too big, the athlete doesn't have, the force, the explosiveness to accelerate. Therefore, your power output is subpar. It's not your maximum power output. And if your power output is not maximum, you cannot expect to measure a maximum glycolytic or lactate production, right? You measure some kind of lactate production, but not the maximum. And if you undergear, then the acceleration is super quick, but maybe you don't reach maximum power because the guy runs out of gears, right? So this is a huge problem. It has become a huge problem in the past years for people trying to determine VLA max, with lactate measurements, just do any kind of sprint test. And so what is different and what is new with the power performance decoder is we use a 20-second sprint test without the lactate. And it is as accurate. We used, as I said, the muscle biopsy data to validate and to compare it. And we were basically able to recalculate, even without lactate samples, the glycolytic energy turnover based on the biopsies. And why this is possible? Because it is a clean anaerobic effort. So if you look into the details of the protocol, you're not allowed to, for example, pedal easy before the effort, right? The athlete basically has to come from absolute rest. And even the software checks for that. So the software is scanning if before the actual sprint test that you try to enter into the power performance decoder, if the athlete rested. And then if you have a completely rested sprint, so a sprint that comes from complete rest, you minimize your aerobic energy production before the sprint. And therefore, you also minimize the ability of the aerobic system to take up lactate. And you maximize your creatine phosphate, because when you rest, creatine phosphate is recharged, right? So basically what you get an as clean as possible anaerobic effort. And then what we can do with that is basically calculate how much of your power output in this 20-second sprint, is coming from the aerobic system, how much is coming from the creatine phosphate system, and then everything that's left over, so to speak, is glycolytic part, is your VLA max. And this is also why now it's a little bit longer. Again, coming back from people who think, it has to be in 15 seconds. It is a little bit longer because when it's a little bit longer, we are already able to see how, and this is what should happen from a physiological point of view, how the VLA max, how the glycolytic energy flux is reduced a little bit after 17, 18, 19 seconds, right? So it gives you a better average, it gives you a better understanding. And sorry for the long answer, but I hope that this kind of created the picture on what are the mechanics or the reasons behind those different efforts.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one follow-up. So in the original test with the ergometer, you needed to have the correct settings and everything. You mentioned that. But why is that less of an issue or a non-issue now with the PPD when you can do it out on the road or on the trainer on your own bike?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Excellent question. Okay. So now we have to go a little bit more technical, but that's cool. Basically, because the 2002, 2003, this is where this came from, 15-second sprint test that we developed, right, was trying to estimate what's called the non-glycolytic time, so to speak, right? So saying within a 15-second test, not all the time lactate is produced, right? In the very first 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever seconds, you primarily use creatine phosphate as an energy source, right? And the original protocol was trying to estimate this based on when you reach max power. So the original protocol with the lactate 15 seconds was trying to estimate your non-glycolytic time using, when do you reach max power, when you decrease from max power. That was basically the idea. And therefore, the problem is the time, again, as we just said, the time to reach max power depends on your gearing, right? It depends on what brake force you have and so on and so forth. So this is why the original protocol was linked to a specific ergometer setting. But then, as things happen, when you try to copy things, a copy maybe misses out a few percent. And very often these ergometer settings are just ignored, right? You just do any kind of sprint. With the problem, then you just measure any kind of VLA Max, but not the VLA Max. So how does a power performance decoder do it differently? Because the power performance decoder is not looking at the time. The power performance decoder is only looking at the energy. So power multiplied by time, obviously, right? So the only thing, therefore, the power performance decoder needs is that you're not able to increase your power output 12 seconds into the sprint. So it doesn't matter, so to speak, how quick you can accelerate. For example, take a triathlete. A lot of triathletes, they mess up if you don't set up the ergometer right, a lot of triathletes mess up the 15-second sprint test protocol because they are so slow, right? They are so slow in accelerating because they're triathletes. They're not track sprinters, right? What happens is time to reach max power is very long and you vastly overcalculate your VLA max, right? And the power performance decoder doesn't really matter what exactly your gearing is. Because again, the only thing that is needed is that your power output is not increasing anymore after 12 seconds into the sprint. And with all given respect, you really, really have to mess up a 20-second sprint if you're able to still increase power after 12 seconds, right? I think that should be intuitively right that, after 10 seconds or 8 seconds, your power will decrease. So in other words, and I'm very, very happy to admit that what I did 18 years ago, with this looking at the time to max power, it was not perfect. It was the very first attempt. It was the very, very first validated way to measure glycolytic power or energy turnover. And yeah, I'm happy to admit that it was not perfect because it really depended on how you set up the ergometer. And looking 18 years back, I'm happy to say, okay, we were able to improve what we did 18 years ago, right? So that's the main difference, why the gearing is not that important anymore, because it's not looking for the time, it's just looking for the energy.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So thank you for clarifying that. Can you discuss the pros and cons of using those different combinations? Like, what would be the advantage of having metabolic cart data or lactate data, or versus just using the power only testing protocol?
Well, so when you use a metabolic cart, the advantage is honestly, technically speaking, not really there. It's mostly because the perceived value of doing a VO2 max test with a mask on your face is higher, and maybe you as the user, you as a coach or scientist using it, you maybe feel better about it, right? Because you feel like you have a direct measurement of VO2, or more direct, or more what you're used to, and therefore you maybe trust the numbers a little bit more, especially when people start using it. Technically speaking, the accuracy is not better, because what people often forget is that yes, a VO2 analyzer, metabolic cart is a great tool, but it's also the most complex and most difficult and most prone to error device that you can have in your toolbox in a human performance lab. So technically speaking, the error of using a metabolic cart is not any better than using the PPD without lactate or with lactate, so power-based wise, right? There is a small difference using the PPD with combination with lactate and without. The accuracy, so the standard average error, using this in combination with lactate is slightly smaller. It is slightly better than just using it with power. But the power is on the same level as the average accuracy or tolerance that you have in your metabolic cart data. So therefore, it doesn't really matter how you want to use it. In most cases, the decision is more on what data do I have, right? So for example, if you, as I said, if you have a good idea, or you feel strong on your FTP value, on your threshold value, you can shorten the test to only be 20 seconds and 3 minutes and get the full data. So you save a tremendous amount of testing time, obviously. And this, for example, is one use case scenario. Or if you're looking for the last 1.5%, 2% added accuracy, then you maybe do one effort, 3-4 minutes all out with lactate. That might be another scenario, adding this into the mix of data, basically.
What is the magnitude of the difference in error roughly between using it with lactate and without lactate?
So in the VLA Max, it's no different. This might be, for most people, might be the most surprising thing. But the accuracy at it currently is, we already have an improved version in the pipeline that might change. But as it stands for now, the determination of the VLA Max is as accurate doing it without lactate as it is with lactate in the PPD. The VO2 Max is, you have an average error in VO2 Max calculation by 2.5% without the lactate, and with lactate, it's a little bit more than 1% in average, and so that's much better.
Okay, and what is the average error of the VLA Max calculation?
Well, with VLA Max, you have to be honest and acknowledge that no matter what you do, even if you use the original protocol from 2002 in a lab on a high-performance ergometer, the reproducibility is good. You will get a very reliable VLA Max in terms of reproducing the same numbers. But if you validate it to an external measurement, for example, directly measured VLA Max versus calculated, or versus what we did, muscle biopsies, you always have to expect a deviation of 0.05 millimoles per liters per second. And this is approximately where the PPD sits as well.
Yeah. Okay. And just for reference for listeners, the VLA Max might range from something between 0.3 to 0.7, 0.8 in most tests that I see. It can be lower and it can be a bit higher, but generally those would be the ranges. And even I would say that when I test triathletes, I mostly see between 0.3 and 0.55 or something is the general range. So then you might get a value of 0.45, but the actual value might be 0.4 or 0.5. So that's the kind of error we're talking about.
And again, you have to be honest and say, this is most likely almost as good as it gets, right? Because if you look at the error sources and the sources that influence, even if you don't want to use the word error here, so let aside the machines that you're using, or using different machines, for example, might come up with a little bit different results. Then some machines need to correct, for example, for hemoglobin mass, because hemoglobin has erythrocytes have higher lactate concentrations. Then you have body composition in there, and you have especially something like, maybe you are slightly glycogen depleted, or you have a slightly changed insulin or whatsoever. And so you have to be honest and say, when you do lactate measurements, as with all other measurements, your power meter, your heart rate, your VO2, whatever, there's an error in there. That is, no matter where you do or how you test, inside, no inside, lab, field, whatsoever, doesn't matter. You just have to acknowledge there's always an error of measurement, right?
Yeah. And then VO2 max, same sort of question. What is the rationale for how is it possible to calculate that with only power data?
Well, believe it or not, this was a more difficult one here, because and it might not be so obvious because you have VO2 max estimations everywhere nowadays, right? Just from power duration curves or from heart rate or whatsoever. We're using an effort which is somewhere in the ballpark of 2.5 and 3.5 minutes, so an effort that is long enough for you to allow you to reach VO2 max, right? And so that let's say I give you one example. Let's say your athlete reaches 450 watts average for 3 minutes, just to say something, right? Then what you can be sure is that in an all-out effort for 3 minutes, those 450 watts are not completely aerobically produced. And your athlete will confirm that by feeling, right? That a significant amount of energy is not coming from the aerobic system, but from anaerobic systems. And if you would measure the lactate levels, obviously it would be elevated and so on and so forth. Well, and so now what we can do by knowing the VLA Max, because we know the performance, we know the power output of your VLA Max, we can pretty precisely narrow down the possible aerobic energy contribution in this 3-minute effort. Right?
Yeah.
So you can say, okay, 450 watts, and you can say, okay, I don't know if 400 watts have been produced aerobically and therefore account for the VO2 max, or 350 or 380. You would not know. But what is possible is taking your VLA max and narrow this range down to a very, very small error. And the truth is, we can only narrow it down to a very, very small range. And I don't know if one day somebody will be able to make it more accurate, so to speak, right? Never say never. But at the moment, I can only tell you that it is possible to narrow your VO2 max down to a very small range. And this range is normally approximately 2 to 2.5 milliliters-ish, right? This is a range from that 3-minute effort that we get. And the truth is, we don't know, let's say if you calculate 60 or 62, right? We don't know if it's 60 or 62. What is happening is we just take, bluntly, 61. We just take the average. So technically, because it's almost impossible that's below 60 or above 62 in this case, so technically it's almost impossible to get an error that is bigger than an average approximately 1.5 milliliters, because this is the size of the range. Only from this. And then on top of that, you get this cross-validation, which I just talked about, which will then afterwards pull your VO2 max slightly up or down, right? So it will, for example, use your FTP value. Let's stick with that example. Let's say we estimated the range being for your VO2 max 60 to 62. The software in the first circumstances picks 61. And then it will use all the other metrics to fine-tune it, and the result that you get might be 61.3 or 60.7 or something, right? Because this is more sound with the other data.
And a question on the protocol. The test can be done on the same day, but is that what you recommend? Because it can also be done on separate days. What do you recommend as the best one? I've kind of seen that for many athletes doing it on the same day, the last test might be not a maximal effort, essentially. It just gets either physically or mentally, it gets to the athlete. So I prefer to give it on separate days. But can you talk about your opinions on that?
Yeah, obviously it depends on the athlete if you can do it or if it's advisable to do it on the same day. As long as you do the order right, so the 3 minutes and the 20 seconds first, or 20 seconds first and then the 3 minutes, because those are the two most single important efforts, so to speak. I have no big problem as long as you keep fueling yourself with carbohydrates, to do it all on the same day, even if the last effort is a little bit off. Really, the effect of it, the error sensitivity on doing whatever your 10 minutes or 12-minute efforts only with 98% is not that huge, really. You can do it over 2 days, and that's the same with, when people use INSCYD with lactate testing, they sometimes do it over 2 or 3 days. And me personally, I really appreciate this setup, doing it over several days, because in most cases, what you want to use the data for is you want to use the data to make informed decisions on your training. Right? You want to know what's your carbohydrate combustion in training, what is my FTP I use in training, my fat max zone, and so on and so forth. So when you spread out testing, PPD, lactate, INSCYD, no INSCYD, doesn't matter for me. When you spread out your testing over several days, you might have a little bit more deviation within the data, even though I would not confirm that I really see that often. But you have the potential to have more deviation, more noise within the data because you spread it out over several days. But it is then and therefore representing a better average, a better overview over what is happening in training. You know what I mean? I'm not a big fan of saying, I want to use the data for training. I have 3 hard weeks of training. I do an easy week. I do 2 days off. I fine tune my nutrition to some specific protocol, and I have a special meal and 3 hours rest. And then I go into a lab and get my fat max measured. No, if this is not the situation how you train, then why create this artificial situation for testing, which has nothing to do with what you do outside in training? So you should not do it when you're totally exhausted after the hardest day of the whole month, but try to do it in a series of days which are representative for your training scenario. Even it involves a little bit more noise, because I think we are often too much carried away with, the accuracy of things, right? I mean, take FTP. I see people discussing improvements in FTP by 5 watts, right? There's no way you can measure it with a maximum lactate steady state more accurately by 7 watts in most cases. Normally it's 10 watts resolution. So, we should not discuss or be carried away with a few watts here plus or minus, because that's your day-to-day variation anyway.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. In scientific terms, you would rather go for a bit more external validity compared to internal validity.
Yeah.
And then in terms of the results that we get, so some listeners have taken the test, some have not, but basically the main metabolic variables that are measured or calculated and then are part of the report that the user gets include the ones we talked about: VO2 max, VLA max, FTP, but also your fat max and your carb max, which is kind of how much power you can produce at the level where you are consuming 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour, which we know is kind of close to the maximum of what we can absorb. But the variables like fat max, for example, and also FTP, what I want to ask about them is, are they almost completely dependent on VO2 max and VLA max, or can they be changed in some way without changing VO2 max or VLA max?
Fat max and FTP?
Yeah.
Just a little bit, not a lot. So it depends a little bit if you talk about the bike or the run, because in the running, or you could also say in the swimming, the running economy or the energy demand for maintaining a certain speed has a huge effect on that, on fat max and FTP. So that is an additional layer in those free motion sports, running and swimming. And then you have smaller influences on something like body composition on those values. And then it's mostly determined for the rest, like the two biggest determinants is really VO2 max and VLA max, because the VO2 max is basically defining, for example, take fat max, or it can also take FTP. The VO2 max is defining or regulating or involved with how much, fuel, so to speak, you could burn, right? Like at what speed is your engine running, so to speak. And the VLA Max is mostly determining, in combination with the VO2 Max, I have to say, to be precise, is mostly determining how much of that fuel is then derived from glycolysis, so from glucose breakdown. So this is where it comes to play with fat max. And in terms of FTP, I mean, it's pretty obviously in terms of maximum lactate steady state, it's a maximum lactate steady state. So it's a steady state. And so it is a product on how much lactate is produced. Again, talking about the glycolysis, mainly regulated by VLA Max, and about how much lactate can be combusted. Again, aerobic system determined by VO2 max. There's not so much wiggle room where you can change your FTP without touching one or the other or both parameters, right?
Yeah.
That's definitely the case.
Yeah. Well, it was a bit of a leading question, but the reason I'm asking is that in particular, when it comes to fat max, there is a lot of talk, that you see around on the internet where people are working on their fat max, quote unquote, and but really what you're working on, if you want to improve it, should be is essentially working on VO2 max or VLA max or both of them, because they are such a large part of determining it.
Yeah, maybe let me before jumping on the training piece of it, maybe let me add something which often creates confusion when people, because you said people get their report or look at their fat max and INSCYD, and there's some confusion sometimes about it, what you see. And I just want to make clear, because it's not directly stated, it's not printed in bold red letters on the report. What you get in the report is, for example, your fat max and your carbohydrate combustion under steady state conditions, and it's only related to the working compartments. So it's only related to the working tissue, right? Because all the data that you get, either in a lactate test or in the PPD, it doesn't really matter. All the data that is processed and INSCYD is derived from the working tissue, right? The power output that you measure on your crank, on your pedal, is really derived from the working muscle, obviously, right? You don't have a power meter on your arms or upper body when you move around on the bike. And the other thing is a steady state, right? So what you see there is obviously not accounting for, I just have a chocolate bar, I increase my insulin level, right? It's not accounting for, additional oxygen uptake or additional fat combustion in non-working tissues. And that's something important for me to note here, because again, for some people, especially lab owners who use INSCYD, it has been a little bit confusing. And if you then normalize your metabolic cart data, so to speak, to take out non-active muscle mass and non-active tissue, I mean, it fits very, very good. So that is important to note here, right? You get an overview, you get a general understanding how your metabolism works, but what you see, it's independent of the time and independent on any, harder efforts in between or these kind of things. It's a general understanding of how your metabolism works. And now, coming back to your training question, when you want to train fat max, right? Or training at fat max. Can you do this, or are you doing this without effectively changing VLA max or VO2 max? Well, again, mostly not, to a very, very small amount. The question is more, are you on purpose changing your VO2 max or VLA max, or is it just happening as a side effect, so to speak? And one thing that is, I think pretty well understood is, for example, when you do high intense interval training, and you do high intense interval training, and you do it successfully in terms of increasing your VO2 max, it has been shown scientifically that this raises your fat max ability. Right, so that's again the same mechanism here. So you can train your fat max by improving your VO2 max, and then it doesn't matter how you do this exactly. By training at fat max, below or above, as long as you raise VO2 max, your fat max will go up.
Yeah. Another thing that I want to get into is, could you give some benchmarks on the amateur side of things for when it comes to VO2 max, VLA max, and FTP? What have you seen in the testing data of the users of INSCYD?
Sorry, can you repeat this?
Benchmark data for VO2 max, VLA max, and and FTP for amateurs that have been using INSCYD? What would be sort of good values to aim for if you want to be kind of like a Kona qualifier or something? Is this data that you have been looking into or have a good idea about?
Oh yeah, I mean, we have in INSCYD, we do have these groups. You can declare your athletes as recreational or amateur or professional athletes. It doesn't change anything about the algorithm. You can go back and forth, change your athlete as many times as you want. Just changing its visualizations or how we rank the performances. So yeah, definitely, we have a database for that from decades actually. So with VO2 Max, it is a little bit more straightforward because it adapts nicely with endurance training, and for regularly training triathletes, you would expect something to see above 40. If you are age group Hawaii qualifier, it would be more in the range of 60 and maybe upwards, but this ballpark, depending a little bit on the age, right? For younger guys, can be even going up to 70. But VO2 Max is in general something which tracks very nicely which how much you train and your general fitness level. And then the VLA Max is becoming a little bit more tricky because you can sometimes you can have also amateur triathletes who go down to like something like 0.3, which 0.4, which is obviously great, right? For increasing fat max and increasing threshold, but mostly for the long distance, mostly the fat max. But then sometimes, and then it gets really exciting in terms of training, you find people who have 0.5, 0.6. And then this offers really the main room for improvement for their long distance training. I just had couple of months ago, I was at a training conference for the German Triathlon Federation and gave a presentation there for their coach education program. And we had Fares Al-Sultan there, the national coach and former coach of Patrick Lange. And he also confirmed that, he doesn't care so much about the VO2 max in his, or actually, he doesn't care at all about the VO2 max in his long distance athletes, because he knows that the VO2 max itself is not important and the threshold is not important. It's the fat max and the VLA max that really decides, your fate in a long distance race.
Yeah, that makes sense. Obviously, you need a good VO2 max to win Kona, but
it doesn't,
I see what he's saying.
It doesn't hurt.
That would happen automatically with training, or more automatically.
It doesn't hurt. And on that note, I think something that is maybe important to remember for the listeners as well: the influence of the VLA max on your threshold and on your fat max increases with the VO2 max. So it's not it is not linear, it's not straightforward. You can just not say, the influence of VLA max on my threshold of fat max is X, Y, Z. It, as most biological systems, they're not linear. It's not the same. Like basically, if you have a VO2 max of 40, because you're not training that much, you maybe just started, then you don't. I mean, it's good to know VLA max and to look at it and to monitor it, right? But it's not your primary training goal. It is something to maybe save for later and already monitor to see how it develops, how it adapts to your trainings that you're doing. But in this case, let's say you have somebody, to make an example of this, a VLA max of 0.7 and a VO2 max of 40. Then honestly, don't bother your VLA max, because the potential to improve your performance by improving VO2 max is much, much higher. And the effect on VLA max on your performance is comparable small. In contrast, if you have somebody with a VLA max of, let's say, 0. Maybe it's the same guy. He starts training and he gets to a VO2 max of 60, and his VLA max is still 0.7. Then it's really time to start working on it, right? Because again, the higher the VO2 max, the bigger the effect of lowering the VLA max is on fat max and FTP.
Yeah, that's really good that you brought that up. That's really, really good information. And do you think something that I've seen is that I think there is a tendency to maybe that we overestimate what we think a typical VO2 max is. And it's good that you mentioned there that 40 might be a completely normal value for a recreational athlete, at least at the beginning part of their endurance careers, so to say. But I do think that even for the more advanced athletes, that there might be a tendency to overestimate what we think that our VO2 max should be, or what a typical VO2 max should be, compared to what the reality is. Would you agree with that, or is that something you've seen?
Well, in my opinion, or my gut feeling, I would say yes. I think, you have to acknowledge that if you train, for example, 10 hours per week, then I would not often expect to see a VO2 max above 60, right? In most people. Yeah. Obviously, that's very general. It's a very simplified saying. But in average, if, like, just to give you a benchmark here or a ballpark number, if you want to see a VO2 max significantly above 60, you either have to train very smart. So I'm not saying it's not possible. Seeing guy in my coaching business with 62, 63, 50 years old, training 8 hours, 7 hours per week. But then you really have to be, spot on with what you're doing and know what works for you and so on and so forth. But in general, 10 hours per week should bring you to a VO2 max close to 60, 58, whatsoever, right? So as said, if you want to have 65, then you maybe need to train 15 or 16 hours. And now we have to ask the question, how many people are really doing this? And here I'm mostly counting the bike and the run part, because the swimming is not contributing so much to your VO2 max on the bike and on the run.
That's another great point for triathletes. What about gender differences? What is a typical difference between what's the average for males versus females?
The numbers that we talked about. Sorry for that. Actually, the numbers I just presented is related to males. In females, it is significantly lower. In females, you are highly trained when you have 60. You see sometimes professionals in cycling, for example, with a VO2 max in the ballpark of 70 or something. So for the female athlete, the numbers are generally significantly lower. You could say maybe a ballpark, maybe be a solid 10 milliliters approximately, right? It is on the one hand a little bit easier to get a higher relative VO2 max because in general females weigh less in average. But on the other hand, the main contributor to the to the VO2 max is the used muscle mass, right? So if you go cross-country skiing, you use more muscle mass, you can expect a higher VO2 max in average. And females have normally less muscle mass percentage-wise than males. And this is one of the main reasons why you see lower VO2 max values with them.
Yeah. Well, I think what you mentioned there as well with the body mass, that brings up an interesting point why I think that VO2 max may be overestimated, because a lot of the benchmark numbers that we see comes from studies in elite athletes that don't have a single kilo of body weight to lose, whereas many amateurs maybe do carry a couple of kilos, even if they're lean, but maybe they carry a couple of extra kilos of body fat compared to what the elites would do. And that quickly decreases your relative VO2 max to body weight. So it gives you so looking at the absolute VO2 max can also be informative rather than just a relative.
Yeah, no, most definitely. Excellent point. That's most definitely right. You could look at something like lean body mass VO2 max, but then it becomes more difficult to compare because how you measured lean body mass and there are different ways, and it's adding another layer of possible error. So that's why you only want to do this when you always do it the same way and the same measurement. But yeah, the extra kilos in terms of extra body fat is definitely something that is lowering your relative number. And we have it this way that in INSCYD, when you do a cycling test, you get both numbers, milliliters per minute and milliliters per minute per kg, because it can both matter when you're riding uphill or in the flat. And in running, because you always have to carry your own body weight, we only display the relative number per kilogram body weight.
And just to, as a reference point, what would be a typical range of VO2 max values that, for example, the professionals at Kona on the male side and the female side would have?
I don't have much data on the female side, to be honest. On the male side, you would expect somewhere in the ballpark of 75. Maybe somebody 77, right? Because again, never hurts, it helps. But in average, maybe not the champion, but in average, you would expect something as low, I have to say, as in the ballpark of 75, maybe 76, 77. So rarely something significant above 80, what, for example, you would see in cyclists more or less all the time, values above 80, right? And again, I don't have good data on the females. I expect, I can only guess here, basically, that it would be in the range of the mid-60s somewhere.
Yeah. And would that be similar on the bike and the run, 75, for example, as a benchmark, or is one higher than the other?
Well, I mean, in average, you see a little bit higher values of VO2 max in the run, because you're using a little bit more muscle mass in general. So yeah, you could see a slightly higher VO2 max there. However, in triathletes who are very balanced trained, you sometimes see the same values in both disciplines, basically.
Yeah. Another question is how sort of like if we do an INSCYD test on the bike, like we do the PPD and we maybe do the power only test, does that tell us anything about our running physiology? Like, let's say we have sort of a relatively low VLA max, for example. Can we then make an educated guess that probably that is the case on the run as well, or might that be completely different and we need to test the run separately?
Yeah, that's super difficult. I just had this discussion 2 hours ago. Yeah, I mean, you can apply this logic and say the VO2 max in the run should be the same or higher. So let's say you came up with VO2 max, as an example, of 60 on the bike. You can say, will be most likely will not be lower than 59 and will most likely be somewhere 60 to maybe 60.5 on the run. That's a kind of an educated guess you can do. And then for everything else, it becomes super difficult or not solid, not legit, not accurate to make an estimated guess, right? I mean, you could just transfer the values, but that's often not the case, right? You can see different VLA max numbers in the run, not totally. I mean, you cannot expect, if you have on the bike 0.3, you cannot expect to have on the run 0.9 or vice versa. But you can see a little difference in both disciplines.
Could you see 0.5 on the run if you had 0.3 on the bike?
Difficult, but depending on running economy, it could be the case. But that's, I would say, somewhere on the edge. I mean, if you apply then the same typical error we talked about in the beginning, you say, the 0.5 could be 0.45, and the 0.3 could be a worst case 0.35. Then, yeah.
All right, I hope that you enjoyed that episode. You can find the show notes as usual on scientifictriathlon.com, and I will link in the show notes and in the episode description to the related episodes, the previous interviews we have done with Sebastian. Definitely, if you have not listened to episode 169, that is sort of the prerequisite knowledge for really getting the most out of this episode, I would say. So if you didn't quite get what we were talking about at points, then it might be worth you going back to episode 169, listening to that, and then coming back to this episode again. Even if you did listen to episode 169, then that's definitely a great episode, one of the most downloaded of all time of this podcast. And so I would highly recommend that you go and revisit that, and then maybe you can come back to this one and listen to it once again. In the next part of this interview, which will be out next Monday, we go more into the training and physiology aspects of things. So this episode was more about the background of the test protocol and the algorithms, how they work and how they can be accurate and so on. And the next episode will be more a general, with or without testing, like what are some fundamental aspects of training and physiology, and how do they relate to the testing, of course, because you can get the most out of your training if you know what your physiology is actually like and what you should be training. But for all intents and purposes, the next week's episode will be a bit more about that general training aspect rather than specific to the INSCYD testing and software. If you haven't already, it would be great if you could go and leave a rating and review for this podcast. I haven't asked in a while, and I noticed that the ratings and reviews really dried up, and it's been a very dry patch in that regard. So it all helps. Every single rating and review helps out. So please, if you haven't done that and you're enjoying the podcast, take a moment to do so. That would mean the world to me. Big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Go and take their free online sweat test and get a personalized hydration strategy for your next event or race, or even just for day-to-day training, especially if you're doing a lot of training, long training hours outdoors in the heat or indoors, which will mean that you will sweat a lot. That's definitely worth it to get a gauge on your sweat sodium concentration. And big thanks to Roka that you can find on Roka.com. You can get 20% off your order with the promo code that you can find on Roka.com/TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.